Charlotte Holloway did not cry at her wedding. She stood with her hands folded at her waist while Edmund Ashbourne, Duke of Mistbourne, signed the register without once looking at her face. The clerk's pen scratched. The ink dried. The Duke set down the pen, picked up his gloves from the edge of the table, and walked out of the registration office before the clerk had finished blotting the page. Charlotte looked at the wall above the clerk's desk. There was a clock there, a plain bracket clock in a mahogany case. The kind that belonged in offices and parlors and rooms where time was supposed to matter. It had stopped. The hands were fixed at 23 minutes past 10, and no one had seen fit to wind it. She filed that away. The carriage that took her north was not the Duke's. It was a hired conveyance. And it smelled of damp wool and someone else's journey. Her 3 cases were loaded on the roof, 2 of them filled with tools. 1 with everything else she owned. The driver said nothing beyond the name of the destination. She did not ask him to say more. She pressed her hand flat against the cold window glass and watched London thin out into Surrey, and Surrey give way to the long roads of the West. In her coat pocket, her father's watch ticked with the small, precise sound that had measured every hour of her life she could remember. She did not take it out. She only rested her fingers against it through the wool. Let's stop things run again. That was what he had engraved on the inner case. In the fine script he used for the pieces he considered finished. She had been 12 when he showed her. She had thought he meant clocks. Mistbourne Castle announced itself first by its gate iron, standing open. 1 hinge listing at an angle that no one had corrected. The gravel drive curved through a stand of ash trees whose branches had grown into one another overhead, and then the castle came into view, 3 stories of grey limestone, every window shuttered. The front face as closed as a sealed letter. A tower rose at the eastern end, taller than the rest, and Charlotte looked at it as the carriage rolled past. Stone. Old work. Good work. Above the front door, set into the arch, was a clock face carved in relief, a decorative piece, not a mechanism. Just the suggestion of one. Its hands were iron. They pointed to 11:47. Charlotte noted the position. She was still holding it in her mind when she stepped down from the carriage and the front door opened. The woman who appeared was perhaps 60. With grey hair drawn back severely and eyes that moved over Charlotte from hem to hat in the manner of someone conducting a professional assessment. They paused, briefly, on the slight weight in Charlotte's coat pocket, the outline of the watch case, the faint chain. Mrs. Ashbourne, the woman said. Her tone made it a question she had not decided to ask. Mrs. Cadcott. Charlotte had read the letter. 3 sentences. No signature. Mrs. Cadcott will receive you. I believe you were expecting me. I was told to expect you. The woman stepped back from the door. Mind the second step. The stone is uneven. Charlotte minded the second step. The entrance hall was dark in the way of rooms that have been deliberately point dark, not neglect, but decision. Holland covers draped the chairs along the wall. The fireplace had not been laid. And on the far wall, between 2 doors, stood a long case clock in figured walnut, a beautiful piece, the casework meticulous. The painted dial still bright. Its hands read 11:47. Charlotte stopped walking. She turned. In the corridor to her left, she could see a bracket clock on a console table. 11:47. She turned again. A carriage clock on the mantelpiece of the room whose door stood open. 11:47. They all read the same. She said. It was not a question. Mrs. Cadcott had stopped a few paces ahead. His Grace gave the order 7 years ago. Every clock in the house, every clock, every one. Charlotte looked at the long case clock. The mechanism would be intact, she could tell from the case condition, no warping. No pest damage, the brass finials still bright. Someone had maintained the exterior. They had simply not wound the interior. The mainspring would be fully released. But the train would be undamaged. A clock like this needed only to be wound to run again. She turned back to Mrs. Cadcott. Is there a record of the clocks in this house? A maintenance register, an inventory, anything kept by the clockmakers who serviced them? Mrs. Cadcott's expression shifted by a fraction. There are household accounts, and maintenance records specifically. From the clockmakers, a pause. There may be invoices that I would like to see them, Charlotte said. And the household accounts. Tonight. If you can arrange it. Mrs. Cadcott looked at her in the way that people look when they have prepared for one kind of problem and been presented with another. Your rooms are ready. I assumed you would want to. You'll see my rooms as well. Charlotte picked up the smaller of her cases herself. Accounts. And invoices first. Her rooms were on the second floor, east-facing. The shutters had been closed for long enough that when Charlotte unlatched them and pushed them open, the hinges protested and the evening light came in gray and reluctant. As if it had forgotten it was allowed. The room was clean. Mrs. Cadcott kept a clean house. Whatever else might be said, but it had the quality of a space maintained for absence rather than occupation. A bed made with plain linen. A writing desk with nothing on it. A fireplace laid but not lit. Charlotte unpacked methodically. 4 dresses. Her sewing kit. Her father's workbooks, 12 of them, the accumulated practice notes of a man who had spent 40 years understanding why things stopped. Her own apprentice journal, the one she had been filling since she was 14. A folded copy of the relevant sections of the Married Women's Property Statutes, which she had copied out herself 3 years ago and kept in every household she had ever worked in as a matter of professional habit. She placed the workbooks on the desk. She placed the journal and the statutes beside them. She took the watch from her coat pocket and set it on the nightstand, where she could hear it in the dark. Then she went downstairs for the accounts. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house. Dora the cook, a compact woman of 40 who had acknowledged Charlotte's arrival with a nod that contained more information than most speeches, had left a lamp burning on the worktable and a pot of tea beside it. Mrs. Cadcott sat across the table with her arms folded and the household ledgers stacked at her elbow, and watched Charlotte open the first one with the expression of a woman who had suspended judgment and was waiting for evidence to resume it. Charlotte read the way her father had taught her to read accounts, twice through for the surface, once more for the structure beneath. The figures were tidy. The categories were correctly labeled. The quarterly totals balanced. She turned to the maintenance invoices. They were kept separately, filed by quarter, tied with twine. She untied the first bundle and began. The invoices were from a firm called Pendleton Sons, clockmakers, established Exeter. The amounts were reasonable, not extravagant, not suspiciously low. The descriptions were professional: inspection and regulation of drawing room timepiece, replacement of worn pivot, library bracket clock, oiling and cleaning, hall long case. Charlotte read them for 20 minutes. Then she set them down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Mrs. Cadcott, she said, "Ma'am, how many clocks are in this house?" Mrs. Cadcott considered. "Counting the tower." 43. Charlotte looked at the invoice in front of her. Inspection and regulation of drawing room timepiece. Singular. She turned to the next quarter. Replacement of worn pivot, library bracket clock. She turned to the next. Oiling and cleaning. Hall long case. 1 clock per quarter. 1 clock per invoice, at a rate appropriate for servicing. 43. She reached for her father's workbook, the one on diagnostic practice, and opened it to the section on wear patterns in neglected movements. Then she stood up, took the lamp from the center of the table, and walked into the hall. The long case clock stood where it had stood for what looked like several decades, its hands at 11:47. Charlotte set the lamp on the console table, opened the case door, and looked at the movement. The mainspring was fully unwound. That was expected, it had not been run in 7 years. But the pivot she was looking at, the one that the most recent invoice claimed had been replaced 18 months ago, had wear marks consistent with at minimum 10 years of continuous use. It had not been replaced. It had not been touched. She closed the case. She walked back to the kitchen and sat down across from Mrs. Cadcott. 4 years, she said. The invoices run back 4 years. Before that? Before that His Grace managed the accounts himself, when he was in residence. Mrs. Cadcott's voice was careful. After he went to London, the accounts were managed by. By whom? A pause. Long enough to mean something. By Mr. Marcus Draper. Mrs. Cadcott said. Mrs. Ashbourne's brother. He offered to assist with the management of the estate after. His Grace agreed. Charlotte looked at the pivot description on the invoice. Then she opened her journal and picked up her pen. 4 years. She wrote. No actual maintenance performed. Payments consistent with full service schedule. She looked up. That I am not accusing anyone in this house. She said. I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever is happening here was arranged before either of us arrived. But I intend to understand it fully. She paused. Starting tomorrow. I am going to need access to every room with a clock. Mrs. Cadcott looked at the journal. Then she looked at Charlotte. All of them are stopped, she said, as if this were relevant information that I know. Charlotte said. That's where I intend to begin. The clock tower was not hidden. It stood at the eastern end of the castle in plain view, accessible by a passage off the main corridor that nobody had bothered to lock. Charlotte found it on the 9th day. Not because she had been looking for it specifically, but because she had been walking the perimeter of the building with her father's measuring tape and a sketch pad, cataloging every exterior clock face she could identify. And the tower was simply the last one on her list. The passage door opened onto a circular stair. She climbed it with the lamp held ahead of her and came out into the mechanism chamber, a stone room perhaps 12 feet across, smelling of old oil and cold metal. With a single window slit that let in a blade of grey morning light, the movement filled most of the room. Charlotte stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at any piece she hadn't seen before, first the overall condition. Then the individual trains, then the details. The frame was iron, hand-forged. Old enough to predate the current castle by possibly a century. This movement had been here before the limestone walls around it. The great wheel was intact. The click spring was intact. The escapement looked intact. The gut lines to the external hands were present and unfrayed. She crossed to the mainspring barrel and checked the tension, fully released. The spring was not broken. She could tell that without removing the barrel. By the way the click engaged when she applied slight pressure to the ratchet wheel. The spring was simply fully unwound. Someone had let it run down and not wound it again. And then someone or the same someone had released the remaining tension so that even the final resistance was gone. That was deliberate. A clock that simply ran down would stop, but the spring would still hold some tension. To reach this state, someone had actively released it. She stood with her hand on the barrel and thought about that for a moment. Then she heard footsteps on the stair, and Toby appeared in the doorway, the stablemaster's son, 16, broad-shouldered, who had been following her at a careful distance since the 3rd day without ever announcing himself. She had not asked him to stop. You knew this was up here, she said. That he looked at his boots. Yes, ma'am. Has anyone been up here recently? Not since I've worked here. Before that I don't know. Charlotte looked at the exterior bell housing, visible through the mechanism chamber's upper opening. The bell was there. It was intact. She walked around the movement frame, checking the hammer linkage, the lifting pieces. The count wheel for the strike train. Everything was in order. The clock was not broken. It had been stopped. Toby, she said. Ma'am. Do you know how to clear ivy from exterior stonework without damaging the joints? He looked up. My father showed me. Before he stopped. Yes. Ma'am. I know how. Charlotte looked at the clock face through the mechanism chamber window. The exterior face, which she had noted from the ground, showed the same frozen hands as every other clock in the house. 11:47. The iron hands were sound. The painted chapter ring was faded but legible, the east face of the tower. She said. There's climbing growth across the upper third. I want it cleared. She paused. Don't touch the clock face itself. Only the stonework around it. Toby nodded. He started back down the stairs, and Toby. He stopped. Don't mention it to anyone inside. Not yet that he considered this with the part 1. Killer seriousness of someone who understood the difference between a secret and a confidence. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went down. Charlotte stayed in the mechanism chamber for a while longer. She put her hand on the great wheel, the largest gear in the train. The one from which all the motion descended, and felt the cold iron under her palm. The clock was not broken. It had never been broken. It had been stopped, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She took out her journal and wrote. Tower movement fully intact. Mainspring deliberately released. All trains in serviceable condition. Estimate. 2 hours to restore full function once decision is made. She looked at what she had written. Once decision is made. She closed the journal and went back down the stairs. The letter from London arrived on the 12th day, addressed in a hand Charlotte did not recognize. Precise. Deliberate script, the kind that is practiced until it looks effortless, which told her something about the writer before she had read a word. The seal bore an impression she did not know. She broke it at the kitchen table, with her morning tea going cold beside her journal. Dear Mrs. Ashbourne. Permit me to introduce myself, as I believe we have not yet had the pleasure. I am Marcus Draper. My late sister Sylvia was the first Duchess of Mistborn. And I have maintained a close interest in the welfare of Mistborn Castle and its estates since her passing 7 years ago. That I understand you have recently arrived to take up residence. I hope you are finding the countryside restorative. Though I confess Mistborn can be rather isolated for those unaccustomed to Devon. Should you find the management of the household confusing or the accounts difficult to interpret, the estate has a rather complex history. I am always available to assist. Indeed. I have been assisting for some years now. And have a thorough familiarity with the arrangements that would take considerable time to acquire from scratch. That I write only to ensure there is no awkwardness between us. The estate's affairs are best managed by those with a long understanding of the family's circumstances. I would not wish any intention but perhaps hasty conclusions to create difficulties that might prove difficult to undo. With warmest regards, Marcus Draper. Esq. Charlotte read it to the end. Then she read it again. She set it on the table and looked at it. The accounts difficult to interpret. He had heard she was looking at the accounts. He had heard within 12 days, which meant someone in this house was reporting to him. Or he had other means of observation. She filed that under things to establish hasty conclusions. He knew she had found something, or suspected she had. Or was ensuring she understood that anything she found could be characterized as hasty, those with a long understanding. This was the blade under the courtesy. She was new. She was an outsider. She was a clockmaker's daughter married to a duke for reasons that London society had already characterized. Ed with the particular efficiency of a city that preferred convenient stories to accurate ones. Whatever she found. He was establishing in advance that she lacked the standing to interpret it correctly. Charlotte folded the letter. She opened her journal to the page where she had been keeping her record of the maintenance invoice discrepancies. And she placed the letter flat against the facing page. She looked at both of them together, the column of false invoices on the left, the courteous warning on the right. Then she picked up her pen. Day 12, she wrote. Letter received from Marcus Draper. Tone, gracious. Intent. Establish my incompetence before I establish his. She paused. He is not worried yet. He is only making sure I understand the rules of the game he thinks we are playing. She capped the pen. Dora, she said. The cook looked up from the range.do. We have good writing paper. Not the household stationery. Plain paper. Good quality. In the desk in the east sitting room. You asked me to find it last week. Good. Charlotte closed her journal. I need it today. She picked up her tea cold now and drank it anyway. Then she went back to the invoices. She had 31 more quarters to check. Mrs. Cadcott came tea. Oh, the kitchen at 6:30 on the 19th morning. Charlotte was already there. She was always already there. The household had understood this within the first week. and had adjusted around it with the quiet pragmatism of people who recognized a fixed point when they encountered one. The lamp was lit. The journal was open. The current invoice bundle was spread across the left half of the table and her cross-reference notes across the right. Mrs. Cadcott did not go to the opposite end of the table. She pulled out the chair directly across from Charlotte and sat down. Which was not what she had done on any of the previous 18 mornings. She set an iron-bound document box on the table between them. It was not large, perhaps the size of a hat box, and it was old. And it had a dent in the left corner that looked like it had been dropped from a height at some point in its history. Charlotte looked at it. Then she looked at Mrs. Cadcott. "That I found this in the linen chest in the upper west corridor," Mrs. Cadcott said. "Behind the winter blankets. I put it there myself, 3 years ago." She paused. "I want you to understand that I did not know what to do with it. His Grace was in London. There was no obvious person to give it to. What is it?" "Open it." Charlotte lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of correspondence, tied with house linen twine. On top was a single folded letter, sealed with a wax impression she recognized from the letter she had received 6 days ago. She did not touch it yet. She looked at the papers beneath 8. Perhaps 10 sheets, some folded, some loose, and beneath those, a document of heavier paper that even from this angle she could see bore an official heading. She lifted out the sealed letter first and set it to one side. Then she untied the twine and spread the papers on the table. The heavy document was at the bottom. She drew it out carefully and unfolded it was a letter of professional engagement, the kind used between business firms to formalize an arrangement before the full contract was drawn. The heading read Draper Asset Management, established London, 1802. It was addressed to a land valuation firm in Exeter. And it was dated 3 years ago. Charlotte read it once through without stopping, then she read it again. The letter discussed a property in Devon not named directly. Described only as an estate of considerable historical value currently lacking active management due to the extended absence of the principal. It requested a preliminary valuation of the estate's land assets, particularly the northern timber acreage and the river meadow parcels. And noted that a formal acquisition offer may be forthcoming within the next 2 to 3 years. Contingent upon the continued deterioration of the estate's operating accounts. Contingent upon the continued deterioration. Charlotte pressed both hands flat on the letter and held it still. "Where was this found originally?" she asked. Her voice was leveled. "It was not found. It was dropped." Mrs. Cadcott's hands were folded on the table. 3 years ago, a man came to the castle. He said he was from the County Land Office. "A routine inspection," he said, "regarding the estate's property records." I admitted him. I showed him to the library. She paused. "I was in the corridor outside when I heard something fall. I looked in through the gap in the door." He had pulled a map drawer halfway out and was looking at the contents. The letter had fallen from his coat. "That he didn't know you had seen it. He was careful to close the drawer before he called for me to show him out. The letter was on the floor behind the drawer unit. I collected it after he left." Charlotte looked at the letter again. Continued deterioration of the estate's operating accounts. The invoices. For years of false invoices, draining the maintenance funds, creating a paper record of expenditure that produced nothing. No maintained clocks, no repaired mechanisms. Nothing. The accounts would show money spent. The estate would show money gone. And someone reviewing the books from outside a court, a creditor. A potential buyer would see an estate whose resources were being consumed without result. A failing estate. Documented as failing. Made to look as though it was failing naturally, through the ordinary entropy of a grieving man's inattention, the man from the land office. Charlotte said. "What did he look at in the library?" "The map drawers." "The survey records, did he take anything?" "Nothing that I saw." Charlotte looked at the map drawers from where she sat. Through the kitchen doorway and across the hall to the library entrance. He had not taken anything because he had not needed to. He had only needed to know where the survey records were. To know they existed. To know they were accessible. Mrs. Cadcott. She said, "Ma'am, has anyone else come to inspect the property? In the past 4 years anyone claiming an official reason to be inside this house?" Mrs. Cadcott thought with the careful, unhurried thoroughness that Charlotte had come to recognize as one of her most useful qualities. "Once more," she said finally. "2 years ago. A man who said he was reviewing the estate's rateable value for the parish records. He was in the East Corridor for perhaps an hour. Did he go into the library? The corridor runs past it." Charlotte folded the acquisition letter and placed it in her journal, between the invoice cross-reference pages. Then she placed the journal on the table and put both hands on its cover. "I am not going to ask you why you did not act on this sooner," she said. "You had no one to act with. And acting alone would have achieved nothing except alerting them that someone had found it. You did the correct thing." She paused. "But I need to ask you one more question. And I need you to think carefully before you answer." Mrs. Cadcott waited. "Is there anyone in this household, anyone at all who reports to Mr. Draper? Who might tell him what happens here, what I am doing, what I have found?" The silence that followed was long enough to be meaningful. And honest enough that Charlotte trusted it. "Not anymore," Mrs. Cadcott said at last. "There was a man, one of the outdoor staff. He left in the autumn. Before you arrived. I don't know if he was replaced." She looked at Charlotte directly. "I don't believe Dora or Toby have any connection to Mr. Draper. I cannot speak to William with certainty. But I have no reason to suspect him." Charlotte nodded. She moved the journal to her left side and pulled the invoice bundle back toward her, the dining room curtains. Mrs. Cadcott said abruptly. Charlotte looked up. "They are salvageable. If we take them down and beat them properly." Mrs. Cadcott's voice had shifted. "Not warm, exactly. But different from the careful neutrality she had maintained for 19 days. I thought you should know." Charlotte looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Cadcott," she said. They did not speak again for an hour. But Mrs. Cadcott did not leave the table. The library had been closed since before Charlotte arrived. Not locked. The door opened when she pushed it, but closed in the way that rooms are closed when the person who used them most is gone and no one else feels entitled to occupy the space they left behind. The shelves were full. The reading chairs were positioned as someone had last left them, angled toward the fireplace at a precise angle that suggested habit. On the desk, a pen had been left in its holder with ink still in the reservoir. Dried to a dark residue, Charlotte lit the lamp on the desk and stood for a moment, getting the measure of the room. The map drawers were in a purpose-built cabinet against the north wall, 12 drawers of graduated depth. The kind made for a household that managed significant landholdings and needed its surveys and title documents accessible without rolling and unrolling from a central storage. Each drawer had a small ivory label. She read them from left to right: county road surveys, drainage plans, kitchen garden layouts, timber acreage north, timber acreage south, river meadow parcels, boundary surveys, full estate, title documents, correspondence with land office. She pulled open the drawer marked boundary surveys, full estate. The document inside was a rolled survey on heavy paper, tied with a faded blue ribbon. She lifted it out carefully, carried it to the desk, and unrolled it with both hands flat on the edges. It was dated 1788. Surveyed and certified by the county surveyor's office, with 3 witnessing signatures and the land office seal. The boundaries of the Mistborn estate were marked in ink that had faded from black to brown but was still entirely legible, every parcel described, every boundary marker identified. Every acreage figure noted in the surveyor's precise hand. The northern boundary was marked by 2 features, a stone wall that had clearly been rebuilt at some point subsequent to the original survey, and she leaned closer, a notation in the margin: double-trunked oak at northern angle. Estimated age 300 years. Immovable natural landmark. She straightened up. The survey was unambiguous. The northern timber acreage was within the estate boundary by a margin that left no room for dispute. The acquisition letter had spoken of that acreage specifically. If the boundary WR made to appear uncertain, if the physical markers were disturbed or removed, a dispute could be manufactured that would complicate any legal proceeding regarding the land's ownership. A dispute that would be very difficult to resolve without this document. She rolled the survey carefully, retied the ribbon, and tucked it under her arm. She went to the drawer marked Title Documents and removed that roll as well. Then she went to Timber Acreage North and took the contents of that drawer too. She wrapped them together in the oilcloth she had brought from the kitchen for exactly this purpose. She went upstairs to her room. She put the package in the bottom of her tool case, the largest of the three, the one with the lock, and locked it. She put the key on the chain around her neck, next to her father's watch. She stood in the middle of her room for a moment, one hand on the watch and one on the key. Then she went back to the library, replaced the empty drawers so that they appeared undisturbed, and returned to the kitchen. Mrs. Cadcott, she said. Mrs. Cadcott looked up from the curtain she had begun taking down from the dining room doorway. From today, the library is not to be entered by anyone I have not personally authorized. Not for any reason. If anyone presents themselves at the door with a professional reason to inspect the property records, anyone at all, I am to be informed immediately, before they are admitted to any part of the house. Mrs. Cadcott looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the manner of a woman calculating how many years of careful, thankless watchfulness had led to this particular morning. Yes, ma'am, she said, and went back to the curtain. Mr. Price arrived on a Tuesday. Charlotte was in the east sitting room when Toby came to tell her a man at the front door, well-dressed, London manner, asking for the Duke. When Toby said the Duke was not in residence, the man asked for the estate agent. When Toby said there was no estate agent currently in residence, the man said he would speak to whoever was managing the property. Charlotte set down her pen. She closed her journal. She did not go to the mirror in the hallway, and she did not change her dress. And she did not ask Toby to make the man wait while she arranged herself into something more prepared. She walked to the east sitting room door and opened it and stood in it. Show him in here, she said. The man who entered was perhaps 45. In a coat that was good quality without being showy, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent a career in rooms where he held the advantage and had stopped noticing that he expected it. He looked around the east sitting room, the uncovered furniture, the open windows, the lamp burning at the desk, the journal and papers arranged with evident purpose, and something in his expression recalibrated without quite reaching his face. Mrs. Ashbourne, he said. I am Gerald Price. I represent Draper Asset Management in certain matters pertaining to. I know who you represent, Mr. Price. A brief pause. He recovered it smoothly, with the ease of someone who had been trained to recover pauses. Then you'll appreciate the nature of my visit. Mr. Draper has a long-standing relationship with the Mistborn estate, and it has come to his attention that there may be some confusion regarding the recent management of the household accounts. It would be entirely natural, given the circumstances of your arrival, for certain figures to appear irregular when in fact there is no confusion. Charlotte said. She had not moved from the doorway. She had not invited him to sit. The room was between them 12 feet of uncovered furniture and afternoon light, and she let it stay that way. Price smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, practiced and patient. The smile of a man who had found that smiling at women who were being difficult was an efficient technique for reducing them. I think perhaps with a fresh pair of eyes, some of the figures can appear. Mr. Price. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. I have cross-referenced 4 years of maintenance invoices from Pendleton and Sons against the physical condition of every clock mechanism in this house. Not one invoice corresponds to any actual maintenance perfo. Remed. The pivot described as replaced in the third quarter invoice of 1,811 shows were patterns consistent with a minimum of 10 years of uninterrupted use. It has not been touched. She paused for exactly 1 beat. I have documented 43 mechanisms. I have inspected 43 mechanisms. The discrepancy is consistent across all 4 years and all 43 pieces. Price's smile did not disappear. But the architecture behind it shifted. Furthermore, Charlotte continued, I am in possession of a letter from Draper Asset Management to a land valuation firm in Exeter, dated 3 years ago, discussing the preliminary assessment of this estate's northern acreage and river meadow parcels, with reference to a potential acquisition contingent upon, and I am quoting directly, the continued deterioration of the estate's operating accounts. She let that sit for a moment. I have been in correspondence with Mr. Howard of the Royal Horological Society's Standing Committee, who is the statutory examiner of clock maintenance records in Devon and who has confirmed that my technical assessment of the mechanisms is consistent with the evidence of no maintenance having been performed. He has agreed to formalize his findings. The smile was still present. The room behind it was empty. Mrs. Ashbourne. Price's voice had acquired a different quality, careful, now, rather than patient. I think it would be prudent, before taking any steps that might complicate the estate's existing relationships, to consult with your husband. His Grace has always maintained a collegial arrangement with Mr. Draper, and any misunderstanding would be best resolved. My husband sent me here to manage this household, Charlotte said. I am managing it. She reached to the desk beside her, picked up a folded paper, and held it out. This is a copy of the technical report I have sent to Mr. Howard. If Draper Asset Management has a legitimate contract with this estate, I expect a copy delivered here within the week. If no such contract exists, the quarterly payments will cease with immediate effect, and Mr. Howard will receive a full account of the discrepancies for submission to the appropriate legal authority. Price looked at the paper. He looked at her. He was doing the calculation. She could see it. The internal reassessment of what he had walked into versus what he had expected to walk into. The calculation was cold and methodical, and she recognized it for what it was. The moment when a man realized a situation was going to cost more than he had budgeted. I'll relay your position to my principal, he said, please do. She did not move from the doorway. Toby showed him out. Charlotte heard the front door close, heard the sound of hooves on gravel receding down the drive. She set the copy of the report back on the desk. 4 seconds later, Mrs. Cadcott appeared in the doorway. That I was in the corridor, she said, by way of explanation. She looked at the doorway through which Price had departed. Then she uncrossed her arms, which she had apparently been holding folded without noticing. What will they do next? Something faster, Charlotte said. She picked up her pen and opened the journal. They have been patient for 4 years because no one was looking. Now someone is looking. And patience is going to start costing them more than they can recover. She turned to a fresh page. Make sure the ground floor windows are secured at night, Mrs. Cadcott. All of them. Mrs. Cadcott looked at her for a moment. Yes, ma'am, she said. And for the first time since Charlotte had arrived. The title arrived without any reservation in it at all. The 31st day began as the previous 30 had. Charlotte at the kitchen table before sunrise, lamp lit, journal open. The current set of documents spread to her left. But something was different in the quality of the morning, not external, not the weather or the light or the sounds of the house waking. But something in how the previous night's thinking had settled. She had written to Howard. Howard had agreed to formalize his findings. She had the acquisition letter. She had the survey documents. She had 4 years of false invoices cross-referenced against 43 physical mechanisms. Each discrepancy documented in her own hand and corroborated by the standard wear assessment methodology her father had taught her and that any competent member of the Horological Society would recognize as correct. What she did not have was the Duke. She had been avoiding the question of the Duke. With the same deliberate attention she applied to everything, not avoiding it because it frightened her, but because she had not yet determined what form the question should take. She was not writing to ask him to rescue her. She was not writing to complain about her circumstances. She was writing because the estate required its principal to authorize any formal legal proceeding. And the estate's principal was in London. And someone needed to tell him clearly and without embellishment what was being done to his property in his absence. She wrote the letter in one draft. She sealed it herself. She gave it to Toby with instructions to ride to the post directly, then she went back to work. His response came in 4 days. She had not expected it in fewer than 7. She was in the clock tower. She had begun spending her mornings there, not working on the mechanism, just sitting with it, taking notes, thinking. When Toby came up the stairs and handed her a letter, the hand was unfamiliar. Quick, unornamental. The writing of a man who used words as instruments rather than performances. She read it standing in the mechanism chamber with the mainspring barrel at her back. Mrs. Ashbourne, I have received your account. I will be at Mistbourne within a fortnight. E. Ashbourne. She read it once. She folded it and put it in her journal. She stood for a moment with her hand on the mainspring barrel, feeling the cold iron. She had written to him because the estate required it. That was the reason. She was clear on the reason. She turned back to her notes and kept working. And she did not permit herself to examine the sensation in her chest that was not quite dread and not quite something else. Because the tower mechanism required her full attention and she had 17 days of work to complete before he arrived, she intended to use every one of them. That he came on the 14th day. She heard the carriage on the gravel drive at 3:30 in the afternoon. She was in the mechanism chamber. She had been adjusting the tension on the click spring for the past hour, a delicate calibration, the kind that could not be abandoned mid-process, and she did not stop. She finished the adjustment, checked the engagement twice, wiped her hands on the workcloth, and descended the tower stairs. She came around the east wing at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. That he was standing in the courtyard. She had not looked at him at the wedding. There had been no particular reason to. She had looked at his hands signing the register and at the clock on the wall and at the door he walked out of. And she had composed herself and gone to find the carriage. She was looking now that he was taller than she had registered. The kind of lean that came from a man who did not delegate all physical labor. There was nothing soft in the way he stood. His coat was good but not fussy. He carried no hat. He as looking at the castle. He stood still for a long moment, looking at it. Charlotte watched him look. She saw the moment he registered that the east wing shutters were open. 3 windows. She had opened them in the 2nd week. When the rooms behind them had been aired and the damp had been dealt with, and there was no longer any reason to keep them sealed. They caught the late afternoon light and held it, and the east wing looked, for the first time in 7 years, like a wing of a house that had people in it. She saw something move across his face. It was not pleasure and it was not displeasure. It was older than either of those, and it passed quickly. And then he turned and saw her standing 20 feet away in her work dress with oil on her hands. They looked at each other. Dalmar Ashbourne, she said. She had decided, on reflection, that she would not call him my lord or your grace until she had some evidence that the relationship warranted the deference those titles implied. She would reassess. Mrs. Ashbourne. His voice was lower than she remembered. He took her in with the same directness with which she had taken him in, though rough, unhurried, not apologetic about the looking. His gaze moved to her hands. You've been in the tower. The click spring needed adjusting. She tucked the workcloth into her apron pocket. You're earlier than I expected. Your letter said within a fortnight. That I didn't specify within or on. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. The shutters, he said, looking back at the east wing. The rooms needed light. They've been sealed for 7 years. Yes. She met his eyes. If that was an error, you can tell me so plainly. He looked at the open windows for another moment. He did not tell her it was an error. He looked at the tower instead. The eastern face, cleared of ivy now, the clock face visible, the hands still reading 11:47, the tower clock. He said, the mechanism is intact. The mainspring was deliberately released. I have been assessing it for the past 2 weeks. She paused. I haven't started it. I didn't think that decision was mine to make. That he was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the tower with an expression that Charlotte filed away carefully, not for later analysis, just filed, the way she filed everything that she did not yet have a category for. Mrs. Cadcott has your rooms prepared, she said. Dora will have supper at 7 if that suits you. Toby will see to your horse, she said it the way a competent household manager says such things, informatively, without warmth or coldness. As a statement of what the house was prepared to provide, that he picked up his traveling case. He had not let Toby take it and walked toward the castle door. .7, he said. .7, Charlotte confirmed. She went back to the tower. Her hands, she noted, were perfectly steady. Supper was the strangest meal Charlotte had eaten since arriving at Mistborn, which was considerable, because she had eaten some strange meals in the past 31 days. The dining room, now fully functional. Mrs. Cadcott had outdone herself with the curtains. The table had been polished to a depth that caught the candlelight cleanly, and Dora had produced a roast that was substantially better than the occasion technically required looked the way it was supposed to look. The silver was not the full service, but what was out was appropriate and well placed. The Duke sat at the head of the table. Charlotte sat at the opposite end. Between them was 8 feet of polished cherrywood and 7 years, and everything that had not been said yet that he ate without commenting on the food. She ate without commenting on his silence. There was a quality to the silence that was not hostile. It was more like two people measuring the same room from different ends to see whether their measurements agreed. Then, midway through the main course, he set down his fork. Your letter described irregularities in the maintenance accounts, he said. Yes, how long have you been documenting them? I began on the first night. I identified the pattern on the second day. She set down her own fork. I have been building the full cross-reference since then. That he looked at her. The first night, the accounts were the first thing I asked to see, and the Horological Society de Mar. Howard. He was my F.A. There's examiner. He certified my father's work for 20 years before the withdrawal of the royal warrant. He knows the standard of my father's documentation. He agreed to review my technical assessment and formalize it, which gives it legal standing independent of my own testimony. She reached for her water glass. His response came 3 days ago. He is prepared to submit his findings to whatever legal body you designate. That he was still looking at her. Not the measuring look from the courtyard, something more focus. The look of a man who has arrived prepared for one kind of conversation and found another. The acquisition letter, he said, from Draper Asset Management to a valuation firm in Exeter, 3 years ago. Discussing the preliminary assessment of the northern timber acreage and river meadow parcels. She set her glass down. The language specifies that an acquisition offer would be contingent upon the continued deterioration of the estate's operating accounts. The false maintenance invoices are the mechanism for producing that deterioration. Money shown as spent, nothing actually done, the accounts presenting an estate that consumes its resources without return. That he was very still. The survey documents, she said. I've moved them from the library. They are in my room. In a locked case. 3 years ago, a man came to the castle claiming to be from the county land office. He was in the library for 30 minutes. Alone. He knew where the survey records were kept and what they contained. I believe the next stage of the plan involves manufacturing a boundary dispute regarding the northern acreage, creating uncertainty about the extent of the estate's land so that any acquisition can proceed at a reduced valuati. On Marcus, the Duke said. The word came out flat and contained, the way words come out when a larger reaction is being held behind them. Yes. Charlotte picked up her fork again. He also manages the social narrative. The letters he has sent me are designed to establish, in advance of any investigation, that I am an inexperienced outsider prone to hasty conclusions, so that anything I find can be discredited on the grounds of my not understanding the family's arrangements. That he set down his fork. He pushed back slightly from the table and looked at the candle between them with the expression of a man who has been told something he half knew and had been not knowing on purpose. How long, he said, has Howard known? He received my first letter 2 weeks ago. He has reviewed the technical documentation I sent him. He will want to examine the mechanisms in person. And he will want to see the original survey documents. She paused. He will want to speak with you directly. the Duke looked at her, then looked at her the way he had looked at the open shutters in the courtyard, that full, unhurried attention turned from the castle to her. The look of a man seeing something hidden that he had been keeping in his peripheral vision. "You moved the survey documents yourself?" he said. "Someone had been in that library and catalogued their location. I did not know when they intended to act on that knowledge, so I removed the material they would need." She reached into the collar of her dress and drew out the chain, 2 keys on it. Her father's watch key and the case key. "The documents are in oilcloth. No one has accessed them since I moved them." He stared at the keys. He was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Ashbourne," he said. "Them are Ashbourne, why did you do all of this?" It was not quite a question. Charlotte set the chain back against her collar, "Because it needed to be done," she said. "And because no one else was doing it." He looked at the candle again. Outside, the Devon night was full and dark. And the windows Charlotte had opened were letting in the smell of moorland and the distant sound of the river. He picked up his fork. He did not say anything else. But he ate the rest of his supper at his own table in his own dining room. In a house whose east wing was lit for the first time in 7 years, and Charlotte noticed without commenting on it that he looked once, just once, at the curtains Mrs. Cadcott had restored, and at the candlelight on the polished wood. And at the bread Dora had made with the particular pride of a woman who had finally been told her work was good, she noticed. She kept it to herself. He stayed. Charlotte had not been certain he would. His letter had said within a fortnight, not for any duration. And she had made no assumptions about what his presence at Mistbourne would look like beyond the meeting that the estate circumstances required. She had prepared for one evening's conversation. She had prepared the documents, organized the cross-references, rehearsed the sequence of presentation the way her father had taught her to present a complex repair assessment. Start with what you can prove, move to what the evidence implies, end with what needs to be decided. She had not prepared for him to still be at the breakfast table the following morning. He ate with the focused quietness of a man who had not sat at his own table in a long time and was relearning what it felt like. Charlotte ate at the opposite end and did not comment on his presence, and he did not comment on hers, and the meal passed in the particular silence of 2 people who have said the important things and are now determining what comes next. On the second morning, she found him in the doorway of the east sitting room. She was at the desk she had been working since 6, the maintenance ledger open to the final quarterly summary, her journal beside it. She looked up when she felt the change in the room's air. He was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, looking at the open windows, at the uncovered furniture, at the lamp on the desk, and at the small earthenware pot of dried herbs that Toby had brought in from the kitchen garden the previous week. "Why mother kept herbs in here," he said. Not to her specifically. To the room. "Toby brought them from the kitchen garden. I've been trying to catalogue what's surviving out there. Some of it has gone wild, but the structure is sound." Charlotte set down her pen. "I didn't know the room had been used for that. She grew them herself." He was looking at the pot. "She said the dried herbs kept the smell of the house right in winter." Charlotte looked at the pot. She had put it there because the room had need. Something alive in it, and she had not examined her reason more closely than that. "The kitchen garden wall needs repointing on the north side," she said. "I've added it to the maintenance list." He looked at her. That recalibrating look, she was beginning to recognize it. The specific quality of his attention when she said something that didn't fit the shape of what he had been expecting. "I've also drafted a letter to Howard," she continued, "requesting that he come to the estate at his earliest convenience to conduct his in-person examination. I can send it today if you want to review it first, or I can send it as written. Your authorization is not legally required for that step. But I thought you might prefer to know." He was quiet for a moment. "Send it as written," he said. He walked away. She heard his boots on the stairs, pausing at intervals the way someone pauses when they are measuring a distance they remember differently than they find it. Mrs. Cadcott appeared in the doorway 4 minutes later. He went upstairs. She said. "I heard." "He hasn't been upstairs in this house in 4 years. Her voice was careful. "The last time he came, he didn't go above the ground floor. He signed the quarterly accounts and left the same day." Charlotte set down her pen and looked at the ceiling. The plaster work, old and sound. The same ceiling that was the floor of the corridor above. Let him walk. She said that he found the ledger copies on the third day. She had left them in the library, organized in the sequence of her investigation: the original invoices, then her cross-reference notes, then the technical assessment, then the acquisition letter, then the survey documentation in its oilcloth wrapping, which she had retrieved from her room now that he was here to authorize its use. She had intended to walk him through it directly and had been waiting for him to indicate he was ready. Instead, she came into the library at 10 in the morning and found him already there, sitting at the reading table with the invoice bundle open in front of him and her summary notes beside it. Reading with the focused stillness of a man who had understood something about himself that he would have preferred not to understand, Charlotte sat down across from him. She did not say anything that he read for 20 minutes without looking up. She waited. Outside the library window, she could hear Toby working in the kitchen garden, the clean sound of a spade turning soil and the more distant sound of rooks in the ash trees along the drive. He turned to the page where she had documented the Pendleton and Sons discrepancies, placed her mechanism comparison beside it, and said without looking up, "Walk me through this." She walked him through it. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She presented the mechanisms, the invoices, the where evidence, the cross-references, and the technical methodology in the same order she would have presented them to Howard: complete information, no inflection of grievance, no performance of the months she had spent doing this work alone. She was not telling him he had been deceived in order to hurt him. She was telling him because the estate needed him to know, and because the man sitting across from her, who was reading her documentation with the full weight of his attention, deserved to receive it accurately. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. 4 years minimum, he said. The earliest irregular payment I can document is 4 years ago. The acquisition letter is 3 years old, which suggests the relationship between Draper Asset Management and the valuation firm predates the formal invoice arrangement. They were building the plan before they began drawing the payments, and Marcus he managed the accounts directly. He introduced the Pendleton and Sons arrangement N months after he took over management. Before that, the accounts were handled by Mrs. Cadcott under your previous estate steward, and they are clean. The discrepancies begin precisely when Marcus assumed direct oversight. He looked at the acquisition letter. He had read it twice already. She had watched him read it. He looked at it again with a different quality of attention, the attention of a man placing a document into a context he had been building for 3 days and finding that it fit with the particular, sickening precision of a key in a lock. He told me the estate was managing well, he said. Every time I asked, he said there were ordinary maintenance costs, ordinary expenses, that he was handling everything, that I needn't concern myself. You were grieving, Charlotte said. He used it. That is not a failure of your grief, Mr. Ashbourne. It is a failure of his character. He looked at her. It was the same look from the dinner table, but with something additional in it now, something rawer, less managed. The look of a man who has been holding himself to a very specific account and has just been offered a different kind of reckoning. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. No. She agreed. I could have sat in the East Wing and waited to be collected. That didn't seem particularly useful. He looked down at the ledger. I should have been here, he said. Charlotte said nothing. She let it sit where he had put it, not in the room, but in him. In the particular place where a man puts the things he has decided to stop looking away from. Some things needed room to land. Toby came to find her on a Thursday afternoon, moving faster than his usual considered pace. And she knew before he spoke that something in the estate situation had changed. The north wall, he said. The boundary markers. Charlotte set down her measuring cord. She had been in the kitchen garden, assessing the wall's repointing requirements, and looked at him. Show me. She followed him along the outer edge of the kitchen garden, through the gate in the eastern wall, and across the rough pasture that separated the formal grounds from the northern acreage. The boundary wall here was old stone, lower than the southern walls, with a wooden post-handrail fence running alongside it where the wall had gaps. 3 posts were gone, not fallen, not rotted through. The ground around each absence was disturbed in the specific way that ground is disturbed when something has been extracted with purpose, soil compressed at the edge. Of the holes, the grass around them bent outward. Two of the wooden rails that had connected to the missing posts lay on the ground. Dropped rather than moved. The work had been done quickly. Charlotte crouched at the first hole and examined the soil. The edges were clean. This had been done within the past day, possibly two. She stood up and looked along the fence line. From here, the northern timber acreage was visible: old-growth hardwood, oak and ash and some elm. Stands of it that had been growing for the better part of 2 centuries. The survey document she had secured described this acreage in precise terms. The boundary was not ambiguous. But if the physical markers were gone, and if someone presented a competing claim to the boundary's position, the resolution of that claim would require reference to the documentary evidence that someone had catalogued, 3 years ago, in the library. Who's been on this side of the property? She asked. Nobody I've seen. But I haven't been watching this line every hour. Charlotte took the measuring cord from her apron pocket and the small journal she carried in the field. She began marking the position of each missing post with fieldstones pulled from the wall. Measuring the distance between markers and recording each figure against a sketch she drew as she worked. The double-trunked oak, she said. The survey document describes it as the northern angle marker. Where is it? Toby pointed. 60 yards along the fence line. In the angle where the north boundary met the eastern edge of the timber acreage, 2 trunks rose from a single root mass, enormous, unhurried, 3 centuries of growth that had made the fence and the wall and every human arrangement around it look temporary by comparison, that doesn't move. Charlotte said. No, ma'am, good. She finished the last measurement and closed the journal. Tonight, I need you to check every section of the north fence line. Mark anything that looks disturbed. Don't repair it. Just mark it and tell me. She looked at the timber acreage. And Toby. Do it before dark. She walked back to the castle quickly. She went to her room, unlocked the tool case, and took out the oilcloth package. She unwrapped it on the bed and unrolled the boundary survey. The northern angle. The double-trunked oak, unmistakably marked, its position measured from 2 fixed points. The distances recorded in the county surveyor's hand. Someone had removed the posts to make the boundary look uncertain. The oak had been standing for 300 years. It was not uncertain. She re-rolled the survey, wrapped it again, and went to find the Duke. He was in the library. She had begun to find him there in the afternoons, reading his way through the estate correspondence files she had organized. Reconstructing the history of his own property with the methodical attention of a man who had decided that looking away was no longer something he was willing to do. She placed the oilcloth package on the table in front of him. The north boundary posts have been pulled, she said. 3 of them. Within the last 48 hours. I've measured and recorded their positions. She opened the survey on the table beside the package. The boundary is not in dispute. It has never been in dispute. The double-trunked oak at the northern angle has been the natural landmark since this survey was drawn in 1788. And it is still standing. She paused. But they don't need the boundary to actually be uncertain. They only need it to look uncertain long enough to complicate any legal proceeding. He looked at the survey. He looked at the sketch she had made in the field. You measured the post positions before you came in. He said that I marked them with fieldstones. The measurements are recorded. If the posts are replaced before Howard's survey team arrives, the record of their removal still exists. She folded her hands on the table. I think we need to write to Howard today. Not to request his attendance, to request a formal survey team, with the legal authority to certify the boundary on the ground. He looked at her for a moment. Draft it, he said. They'll sign it tonight. She reached for the writing paper she had placed in the library desk 3 weeks ago, the day she had cleared and reorganized the room. She had known, when she put it there, that she would need it eventually. She had not known that he would be there to sign it. She sat down at the desk and began to write. The letter from Marcus arrived on the 5th evening of the Duke's stay. Charlotte knew it was from Marcus before she saw the hand. She recognized the seal impressio. N on the folded paper that Mrs. Cadcott placed on the library table with the afternoon post. She took her own correspondence and left the Duke's in front of him without comment. She was in the kitchen garden when he found her, 20 minutes later. Moving between the herb beds with her journal open to the cataloging pages she had been building since the third week that he held the letter at his side. He did not speak immediately. She looked at him once, registered the set of his jaw, and went back to her notes. "You've seen his letters to you," he said. It was not a question that he wrote twice. "Both are in the journal with the other documents." She finished the entry she was writing. "What does his say?" He held it out. She read it standing in the kitchen garden with soil on her gloves. "Edmund, I understand you have gone to Mistborn. I do hope whatever your wife has been telling you has not caused you undue alarm. You know how it is when someone new to a household mistakes ordinary business arrangements for something more troubling. It comes from inexperience, and from not understanding the history of the family's affairs. I have always managed Mistborn's interests with Sylvia's memory in mind, as I know you would wish. I thought it might be useful to speak privately before you take any steps based on incomplete information. I will be at the Beaufort Arms through the end of the month. Come when you are ready." Charlotte read it twice. She handed it back. "That he doesn't know you've seen the documents," she said. "He thinks you've only heard my account of the accounts. He believes if he can speak to you privately, he can give you another framework for what I've found, one in which I am inexperienced and hasty, and he is the faithful guardian of Sylvia's memory." She paused. "He has been confident of that approach for a long time. It has worked before," she said it without heat. It was simply a fact about the tie-in, and about the 7 years that had preceded it, and she watched him absorb it without flinching, which told her something. "That it won't work this time," he said. "No." She turned back to the herb bed. "Don't go to Beaufort, Mr. Ashbourne. Write to Howard instead. Ask him to bring his survey team as soon as he can manage. The boundary documentation should be in the legal record before Marcus attempts any formal claim." That he was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to ask me why I trusted him. That isn't my business, Latte." It was the first time he had used her name alone, without the title. Just her name, plain and direct. The way he said everything. She went still over the herb bed. "Ask me." She straightened up. She turned and looked at him. She thought about it, genuinely considered whether she wanted to open that particular door, what was on the other side of it. What it would cost both of them to step through. "After," she said. She met his gaze steadily. "After Howard comes and the survey is certified and the legal record is established." She held his eyes. "The estate first. Then we can talk about the rest." That he looked at her for a long moment, then he went inside to write to Howard. Charlotte was in the clock to WER at 10 o'clock that night. She had taken to coming up in the evenings when the rest of the house had quieted, not to work, or not only to work, but because the mechanism chamber was the room in the castle where she felt most clearly what she was doing and why. The great wheel. The click spring. The gut lines running to the hands outside. Everything present, everything accounted for. Everything waiting for a decision that she had been holding in careful suspension for 35 days. She was checking the count wheel for the strike train, running her finger along the notches, counting them. Verifying that the sequence was correct when she heard boots on the stair. That he came into the mechanism chamber and stopped in the doorway. He was carrying something, a letter, she saw, folded once, held loosely. He looked at the movement. At the great wheel and the barrels and the lines running up to the bell housing, and then at her. He wrote, he said. She waited. He crossed the room and set the letter on her workbench. She did not pick it up immediately. She finished counting the notches on the count wheel, all present, all correctly spaced, and then she took the letter and read it by the lamp. Marcus' hand was the same as always, precise, deliberate. But the letters pressed harder into the paper than they had before. And the lines were fractionally less level. Charlotte had spent enough time reading documents closely to know the difference between composed handwriting and controlled handwriting. That he was not composed. The letter was 3 pages. It characterized Charlotte as a woman of no social standing who manipulated a grieving man's household accounts into a weapon against his oldest friends. It invoked Sylvia's name 4 times. It described the Draper family's decades of devotion to the Ashbourne estate. And in the final paragraph, it said, "I have always acted in your best interests. Edmund. I ask you to consider whether the woman currently occupying your house has any interest in you beyond the security your name provides her. And whether Sylvia, who loved Mistborn as few people have ever loved a place, would recognize what is being done to her home in the name of this stranger's ambitions." Charlotte finished reading. She set the letter down on the workbench beside her tools. "He's frightened," she said. "He's attacking you." "Same thing, at this stage." She looked at the letter for a moment. Then back at the movement. "He's trying to make you doubt me before Howard's documentation becomes the legal record. If he can separate you from what I've found, make it my account rather than the evidence, the case weakens. You become a grieving man who was manipulated by an ambitious wife, rather than an estate owner who was defrauded by a trusted associate." She paused. "He is wrong. You know that I know that." The words came out hard and immediate. "What are you going to do with the letter?" "Write back, carefully," she said. Charlotte. The same directness as before, but different in quality, something beneath the surface of it that had not been there in the kitchen garden. "I know how to handle Marcus." She looked at him. "Do you?" He held her gaze. "I didn't. I know that. I let him manage my affairs and my distance from this house because it was easier than feeling anything about any of it." He set the letter on the bench between them. "I understand that now. I understand it because you showed me what it looked like from the OU side." Charlotte said nothing for a moment. "Write the letter," she said. "But send a copy to Howard before you post it." He nodded. He did not leave. She went back to the count wheel, and he sat down on the stone ledge below the mechanism window. And the tower was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a room full of machinery that is not yet running, all that potential motion held in stillness. 1147. She said. She said it to the count wheel. Not to him. That he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Yes," he said. She kept her finger on the count wheel. "That was when you received the message. The midwife sent a boy. It was the last night of the year. I was in the library. I heard the clock strike the quarter. And then the boy came." A pause. "I told Mrs. Cadcott to stop the clocks. I don't know if I thought about it particularly. I did not want to hear them any more." Charlotte listened. She did not put anything in her expression. She kept her hand on the count wheel and let him say it at whatever pace it needed to be said. "That I came back to London 2 weeks later. I told myself the estate was being managed. Marcus wrote every quarter. The accounts where they appeared correct. I didn't look closely because I didn't want to look at anything that was here." Another pause. "She planted those herbs. ones in the east sitting room. She would have hated what I let happen. My father," Charlotte said, "had a phrase he used when he was teaching me. He engraved it inside every piece he considered finished." She took out her watch. She had been carrying it in her work apron pocket, as she always did, and held it in her palm without opening it. He said it was the most important thing he knew about clocks. About anything. She set the watch on the workbench, in the lamplight. Between the letter and her tools. "Let's stop things run again." The tower was very quiet. "That he meant clocks," she said. "I thought so, for a long time. I was 12 when he showed me. I thought he was talking about clocks." She looked at the movement, the great wheel, the barrels, the click spring. All of it waiting. He wasn't only talking about clocks. The Duke looked at the watch. He looked at it the way he had looked at the open shutters on the first day that Oldorthan pleasure, Oldorthangriff expression that she still did not have a name for. What happened to his warrant? He said that he refused to certify a timepiece that Lord Fenwick wanted authenticated as a 17th century piece. It was made in 1790. My father knew within 30 seconds of examining it. He said so, in writing. And Fenwick had the warrant withdrawn. She paused. He said it was the correct thing to do. He said a clockmaker who signs his name to something false is only a clockmaker in the formal sense that he sounds like someone worth knowing that he was. She picked up the watch and put it back in her pocket. He would have liked this tower. The Duke looked up at the bell housing, at the barrel of the great bell visible through the opening above them. He looked at the mechanism, at the whole assembled logic of it, every piece in its correct relation to every other. Ready, when I came back, he said slowly. I told myself I was coming for the accounts. For the legal situation. For the documents you'd described. He paused. That was true. But it stopped being the whole truth somewhere around the second morning. When I found you in the east sitting room and you didn't adjust yourself or explain yourself or perform anything. You just said, is there something you need? And went back to work. Charlotte was still that I have not been at home in myself for 7 years. He said. And you were entirely at home in yourself, in my house, in a situation you had no reason to manage as carefully as you did. And he stopped. It reminded me that it was possible. Charlotte looked at the count wheel. She looked at it for a long time after. She said. You agreed. Howard arrives in 4 days, then in 4 days that he looked at her. Something in his face shifted, that unnamed expression resolving into something she could almost put a word to. All right, he said. They sat in the tower until past midnight. Not talking about the estate. Not talking about Marcus or Howard or the boundary survey. They talked about Sylvia. He talked about Sylvia, and Charlotte listened. And she heard a man putting something down in the correct corner of the room rather than spreading it across everything. They talked about her father. They talked about what a clockmaker learns that other people don't, about the way every mechanism teaches you that nothing runs on its own. That everything requires the daily small decision to keep it going. The lamp burned steadily. The mechanism waited. At midnight, Charlotte stood up and said good night. She went downstairs. She lay in her room in the dark with her hands folded and felt, for the first time since arriving at Mistborn, that she was not managing a situation. She was living in one. Howard arrived 6 days later, and he brought 2 men with him. Charlotte had expected the examiner. She had not expected the survey team. 2 men from the county land office. Both carrying the specific equipment of people who had reviewed significant ground before arriving and had formed professional opinions about what they expected to find. Howard himself was 60, white-haired. With the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 4 decades understanding exactly what mechanisms were trying to tell him. He shook Charlotte's hand before he shook the Duke's. Mrs. Ashbourne. He said. Your technical documentation was among the most precisely constructed assessments I have received in 30 years of practice. The mechanisms made it straightforward, Charlotte said. The where evidence is unambiguous, where evidence is never straightforward to document. Howard said. The skill is knowing which surfaces to examine. He looked at her with the full attention of a man reassessing what he was looking at. Shall we begin? They spent the first day in the mechanism chamber and the library. Charlotte laid out everything, every invoice, every cross-reference. Every mechanism assessment, every document in the sequence she had assembled them, and she walked Howard through the timeline the way she had walked the Duke through it. And she watched Howard's face as he examined the pivot where on the long case movement she had brought to the library table for the purpose that he looked at the pivot for a long time. This has not been serviced in the period covered by these invoices. He said. No. The wear pattern is consistent with a minimum of 10 years of uninterrupted use, and the invoice describes a replacement point 3 years ago, 3rd quarter. Howard set the movement down carefully. He looked at the invoice. He looked at the acquisition letter, which Charlotte placed beside it. He read the acquisition letter once and set it down on the table in the manner of a man handling something that is simultaneously fragile and dangerous. This, he said to the Duke, is not a misunderstanding. No. The Duke said, this is a coordinated arrangement to deprive the estate of its assets through falsified maintenance expenditure, with the documented intention of acquiring the northern acreage at a distressed valuation. Howard's voice was precise and without theater. The invoices without corresponding work constitute recoverable payments. The acquisition letter establishes intent. Together they constitute a pattern that no court in England would regard charitably. Can it be proven? Charlotte asked. Howard looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been asked the question he was about to answer. The false invoices are demonstrable through the physical evidence of the mechanisms themselves. My examination will confirm your assessment and place it in the legal record. D. The acquisition letter is the most significant single piece. It is addressed on Draper Asset Management stationery and signed. There is no ambiguity about its authorship. He paused. Do you have any record of authorizing a management arrangement with Marcus Draper? None. The Duke said, then he has no legal standing for a single payment. Howard closed the journal he had been reading. The survey team will certify the boundary tomorrow. The physical evidence of the post-removal your field measurements. Mrs. Ashbourne will be incorporated into the record. He looked at her steadily. You should understand that when this moves forward, your role will be visible. There will be people who prefer to characterize what you have done as interference. A new wife causing trouble in affairs she doesn't understand that I understand. Charlotte said that it may be uncomfortable. Damar. Howard. Charlotte said evenly. I was sent to a house where every clock had been stopped and told to manage what remained. I chose to manage it. She paused. I am not afraid of uncomfortable. Howard looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. With the particular nod of a man who has taken a full measure of something and found it sufficient, the Duke, across the table, said nothing. But Charlotte felt him look at her. The survey team certified the boundary on the second day. Their measurements matched Charlotte's field notes exactly. Every stone marker she had placed, every figure she had recorded in her journal. Confirmed to the inch by professional instruments. The double-trunked oak stood at the northern angle precisely where the 1788 survey had placed it, unmoved, unmovable. 3 centuries of growth that made the missing fence posts look like the minor interference they were. The news reached Marcus 4 days after Howard's formal findings were submitted. Charlotte knew this because she was in the mechanism chamber when the Duke came up the stairs. And she knew from his step before she saw him. She had learned his step in the first week, the particular weight and pace of it. The way it differed from Toba's and from Mrs. Cadcott's and from every other set of footsteps in the house. That something had resolved. He came into the mechanism chamber and stood for a moment, looking at the movement. Howard submitted the findings this morning. He said. The Royal Horological Society has formally censured Pendleton and Sons and referred the matter to the Magistrates' Court. Marcus' legal representative has been in contact with Howard's office. He paused. They are discussing settlement terms. Charlotte set down her tools. The annual dinner of the Royal Horological Society is in 3 days. He said. In Exeter. Marcus will be there. He is a subscriber. Howard will be presenting the findings publicly. He looked at her. I have been asked to attend and to make a statement. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She understood what he was asking. Go. She said, you want be there. No. She met his eyes. That's correct. Go anyway. He held her gaze. Something moved across his face, not the unnamed expression from the tower, but something resolved from it, something that had arrived at its destination. I won't hesitate. He said that I know. She picked up her tools. Send a copy of your statement to Howard before you deliver it. He left for Exeter on a Thursday morning. Charlotte stayed at Mistbourne and worked. She did not wait by the window. She did not ask Toby to watch the road. She spent the morning with Howard's remaining associate, who had stayed to complete the boundary documentation, reviewing the final survey calculations. She spent the afternoon in the tower. The main spring barrel sat in its frame, wound and ready. She had wound it the previous evening, a careful, deliberate process. Each quarter turn of the winding key deliberate. The spring tension building with the patient logic of a mechanism returning to its designed state. The barrel was wound. The click was engaged. The train was free. Every component of the movement was in the position it was designed to occupy. She had not released the click spring. She had not Ted the pendulum. She was waiting. Mrs. Cadcott brought tea to the kitchen garden at 4 o'clock, which she had not done before. Charlotte looked at her when she set the tray down. "You're not worried about him," Mrs. Cadcott said, sitting down on the bench beside the wall as though she had always sat there. "Not the way I thought you might be. He knows what he's walking into." Charlotte accepted the tea. "He won't hesitate. Mrs. Cadcott poured for herself. She looked at the kitchen garden, the repointed north wall, the cleared herb beds, the structure that had always been sound showing through the recovered growth. "You've been very careful," Mrs. Cadcott said, "not to want anything for yourself out of this." Charlotte looked at her tea. "I've wanted the estate secured, that isn't what I mean. And you know it." Mrs. Cadcott set down her cup. "He was a good man before grief made him absent. Anyone with eyes can see he's been coming back to himself in this house." She paused. "I'm not a sentimental woman, Mrs. Ashbourne. But I'm an honest one. And honestly you are allowed to want something for yourself." Charlotte looked at the herb beds. "After," she said. Mrs. Cadcott made a small sound that was not quite exasperation. "You and your afters," she said. "The Duke came back on a Friday evening." Charlotte heard the carriage and was in the mechanism chamber. She heard his boots in the courtyard below, heard him speak briefly to Toby, heard his step cross the entrance hall and move through the house. She heard him on the tower stair that he came into the mechanism chamber. He looked tired, not defeated, not diminished, but tired in the way of a hard thing done correctly. He looked at the movement, at the wound barrel, at the click spring still engaged. He looked at her. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Marcus had arranged the evening carefully, his allies positioned, the narrative established in advance. The room prepared to receive a grieving duke who had been led astray by an inexperienced wife. He had spent the first hour allowing it to breathe, then the duke had walked to the center of the room. He had not gone to Marcus. He had not taken the easy path to the nearest friendly face. He had walked to the center of the room and asked for the attention of the people there, and he had received it, because he was Edmund Ashbourne and he had not spoken in a public gathering with this kind of direct intention in 7 years. And the room felt the difference. He told Charlotte what he had said. She listened without speaking. He had told the room that the Mistbourne estate had been subjected to 4 years of falsified maintenance expenditure by a firm whose principals were present in the room. He had told them that the Royal Horological Society had confirmed the irregularities and that legal proceedings were underway. He had told them that the boundary markers of the northern acreage had been physically removed in an attempt to manufacture a property dispute, and that this attempt had been documented, measured, and certified before it could achieve its purpose. And then he had said, "The investigation was initiated and conducted by my wife, Charlotte Ashbourne, who arrived at Mistbourne to find the estate's accounts in a condition that should have been identified years ago, and was not identified because the people responsible for it had relied upon no one looking closely enough. She looked. She documented everything she found. She secured the estate's legal records, established the evidentiary basis of this entire proceeding, and conducted herself throughout with a precision and integrity that I have not seen matched in 20 years of managing my family's affairs." He had looked directly at Marcus when he said the next part. "I will not be receiving advice regarding my household or my marriage from anyone who has spent for years treating my absence as a financial opportunity." Marcus had left the room. His legal representative had followed him approximately 4 minutes later. 3 of the men who had been present, Howard had told him afterward, would be making voluntary statements to the magistrate's office before the week was out. Charlotte listened to all of it. When he finished, the mechanism chamber was quiet. Outside, the Devon night was full and dark, and the moorland smelled of rain. "You didn't have to do it that way," she said publicly. "In that room I know, you could have let Howard handle the legal proceedings and allowed the social narrative to settle on its own. I know so why." He looked at her. Not the unnamed expression from before something arrived. Something that had made the full journey from where it started to where it was. "Because he called you a stranger," he said. "In a room full of people who were prepared to believe it. He used Sylvia's name and called you a stranger in her house. And every person there was going to carry that word back to their drawing rooms and let it harden." He paused. "I was not going to let that happen." Charlotte looked at him. she had made herself a promise, on the first morning in the cold East Wing bedroom. That she was not going to want things she couldn't afford to want. She had kept that promise through 13 days of early mornings and mechanism assessments and false invoices and pulled fence posts and everything else. She had kept it carefully. With both hands, she was looking at Edmund Ashbourne, who had walked into a room full of his own world and said her name like it was the most relevant fact in the room, and she felt the promise flex under the weight of that. She held it anyway. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Don't thank me." Direct, without softness. "I told the truth. That is all that it wasn't all," she said. "And you know it." They stood in the mechanism chamber with the wound movement between them and the Devon night outside and the lamp burning steadily on the workbench. "Charlotte," he said, "the estate first." She said. "That was the agreement. The estate is in Howard's hands. The proceedings are underway that I know, then." "I know," she said again, and she heard something in her own voice that she had been keeping below the surface for a long time. She looked at the movement at the great wheel. The click spring, the wound barrel. Everything present. Everything ready. "Give me until morning." She said that. He looked at her. He nodded. He went downstairs. She heard his step cross the hall below. She stood alone in the mechanism chamber for a moment. Then she picked up her father's watch from the workbench, opened the case, and looked at the engraving inside. "Let's stop things run again." She closed the case. She reached for the pendulum, long, brass-lanced, hanging in the case below the movement, and drew it back. She held it at the point of release for one breath. 2. She let it go. The pendulum swung. The escapement engaged. The great wheel moved one tooth, and then another, and the clock began to run, the mechanism filling with sound. The steady measured beat of a thing that had been waiting for 7 years to do what it was made to do. She listened to it for a long moment. Then she went downstairs. He was in the kitchen. The lamp was lit and Mrs. Cadcott had left bread on the table and gone to bed. And he was sitting with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. She put her father's watch on the table between them, open, so the engraving was visible. "I came to Mistborn with 2 things that were mine," she said. "My father's tools and his watch. He gave me the tools because he said a woman who knew how to repair things would never be entirely without resources. He gave me the watch because he said it was the best work he had ever done. And the best work should go to the person who understood it." She looked at the watch. "I have been carrying it since the morning he died. I take it out when I need to remember what it sounds like when something is running correctly." He looked at the watch. He did not touch it. "The first morning I was here," she said, "I stood in the hall and counted the clocks. 43 clocks. All stopped at the same minute. And I thought someone did this deliberately. Someone made this decision and carried it out with precision. That is not a broken person. That is a person who is still capable of acting with intention." She paused. "I thought I should remember that." The fire had burned low. The kitchen was warm and quiet. "I have not known how to be a husband," he said. "Not since I knew how, once. And then I left. And stayed gone long enough that I was not certain the knowledge was still where I had left it." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "You wound the clock in the hall every morning," she said. "The long case clock in the entrance hall. You wound it every morning since the first day you arrived. 7 years it stood at 11:47 and you came back and wound it." He was still. "I noticed," she said. "On the second morning. I noticed it every morning after that." She looked at the watch between them. "That is how I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were capable of noticing a stopped thing and doing the small work of starting it again." She met his eyes. "That is the whole skill. That is all it ever is. Yo. You see what has stopped. You do the work, daily, of keeping it going. That is what my father meant." She paused. "That is what I think he meant when he said it about everything." He reached across the table and took her hand. Not with urgency. Not with the performance of a man making a declaration. He took her hand the way you take the hand of some. When you have decided you are not going to let go of, from the entrance hall, the long case clock struck midnight. He had wound it that morning, as he wound it every morning, clear and even, one stroke after another, the tower bell joining from outside, deeper. Filling the moorland night with the sound of time running correctly, she let him hold her hand. The clock counted out its strokes and settled into its steady tick. The watch lay open between them on the kitchen table. The engraving catching the lamplight, "Let's stop things run again," the fire burned. The house breathed around them, every window of the east wing open to the night air, the herb smell moving through the halls. The sounds of a house that had people in it who intended to stay. Charlotte looked at the man across the table, who had wound the clock every morning and who would wind it tomorrow, and felt the promise she had made to herself on the first cold morning quietly, completely fulfill its purpose. She had kept it. She had kept it all the way to the moment when keeping it was no longer necessary. "All right," she said. Outside, the Devon night was full and present and entirely itself, and the clocks of Mistborn kept perfect time.